Here's the good news. While mainstream outlets denied me a critical platform, they didn't shut down my ideas, which have especially flourished among young voters and independent voters, thanks to the alternative media. Many months ago, I promised the American people that I would withdraw from the race if I became a spoiler. A spoiler is someone who will alter the outcome of the election but has no chance of winning. In my heart, I no longer believe that I have a realistic path to electoral victory in the face of this relentless systematic censorship and media control. So I cannot in good conscience ask my staff and volunteers to keep working their long hours or ask my donors to keep giving when I cannot honestly tell them that I have a real path to the White House. Furthermore, our polling consistently showed that by staying on the ballot in the battleground states, I would likely hand the election over to the Democrats, with whom I disagree on the most existential issues: censorship, war, and chronic disease. Oh, I want everyone to know that I am not terminating my campaign. I am simply suspending it and not ending it. My name will remain on the ballot in most states. If you live in a blue state, you can vote for me without harming or helping President Trump or Vice President Harris. In red states, the same will apply. I encourage you to vote for me. And if enough of you do vote for me, and neither of the major party candidates win 270 votes, which is quite possible, in fact, today our polling shows them tying at 269 to 269, and I could conceivably still end up in the White House in a contingent election. But in about 10 battleground states where my presence would be a spoiler, I'm going to remove my name, and I've already started that process and urge voters not to vote for me. It's with a sense of victory and not defeat that I'm suspending my campaign activities. Not only did we do the impossible by collecting 1 million signatures, we changed the national political conversation forever. Chronic disease, free speech, government corruption, breaking our addiction to war have moved to the center of politics. I can say to all who have worked so hard for the last year and a half, thank you for a job well done. 3 great causes drove me to enter this race in the first place, primarily. And these are the principal causes that persuaded me to leave the Democratic Party and run as an independent. And now to throw my support to President Trump.
Wow. This is a nice place. And I'm just talking to Javier. You got thousands of people outside on the street. They want to get into your restaurant, Javier. We're going to have to expand it.
I have to make a lot of tacos now.
You're right. You're right. And thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for being here. We just had a very nice endorsement from RFK Jr., Bobby. And I'll be talking about that. We're heading out right after this. We're going to be going to Arizona. We'll be talking about that and a lot of other things too. But I just want to thank everybody, and I want to thank Bobby. That was very nice. That was really very nice. That's big. He's a great guy, respected by everybody. So thank you all for this incredible welcome we're getting. And I'm going to tell Javier the next time we do this together, he's going to give me a little light up here. You know, can you give me a little light so you can read this little speech? But you know what it does? It makes you speak a little bit less, so that's okay too.
But judging by her bellicose, belligerent speech last night in Chicago, we can assume that President Harris will be an enthusiastic advocate for this and other neocon military adventures. And President Trump says that he will reopen negotiations with President Putin and end the war overnight as soon as he becomes president. This alone would justify my support for his campaign. Last summer, it looked like no candidate was willing to negotiate a quick end to the Ukraine war, to tackle chronic disease epidemic, to protect free speech, our constitutional freedoms, to clean corporate influence out of our government, or to defy the neocons and their agenda of endless military adventurism. But now one of the two candidates has adopted these issues as his own, to the point where he has asked to enlist me in his administration. I'm speaking, of course, of Donald Trump. Less than 2 hours after President Trump narrowly escaped assassination, Callie Means called me on my cell phone. I was then in Las Vegas. Callie is arguably the leading advocate for food safety, for soil regeneration, and for ending the chronic disease epidemic that is destroying America's health and ruining our economy. Callie has exposed the insidious corruption at the FDA, the NIH, the HHS, and the USDA that has caused the epidemic. Callie had been working on and off for my campaign, advising me on those subjects since the beginning. And those subjects have been my primary focus for the last 20 years. I was delighted when Callie told me that day that he had also been advising President Trump. He told me President Trump was anxious to talk to me about chronic disease and other subjects, and to explore avenues of cooperation. He asked if I would take a call from the president. President Trump telephoned me a few minutes later, and I met with him the following day. A few weeks later, I met again with President Trump and his family members and closest advisors in Florida. In a series of long, intense discussions, I was surprised to discover that we are aligned on many key issues. In those meetings, he suggested that we join forces as a unity party. We talked about Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals. That arrangement would allow us to disagree publicly and privately, and fiercely, if need be, on issues over which we differ, while working together on the existential issues upon which we are in concordance. I was a ferocious critic of many of the policies during his first administration, and there are still issues and approaches upon which we continue to have very serious differences. But we are aligned with each other on other key issues, like ending the forever wars, ending the childhood disease epidemic, securing the border, protecting freedom of speech, unraveling the corporate capture of our regulatory agencies, getting the U.S. intelligence agencies out of the business of propagandizing and censoring and surveilling Americans and interfering with our elections. Following my first discussion with President Trump, I tried unsuccessfully to open similar discussions with Vice President Harris. Vice President Harris declined to meet or even to speak with me. Suspending my candidacy is a heart-rending decision for me, but I'm convinced that it's the best hope for ending the Ukraine war and ending the chronic disease epidemic that is eroding our nation's vitality from the inside, and for finally protecting free speech.
He says he's going to stay on the ballot in 40 other states. Is that sufficient? Do you think he should try to get off the ballot in all states?
Well, I think they're trying to get off ballot. I mean, we'll see. I mean, they're going to have to work that out.
Mr. President,
I think having his support is...
Mr. President, RFK, his words about your policies and praising your policies, is that to help you beyond affiliated, like in North Carolina, the independent vote, and the Jewish vote, considering...
Well, I think so. He's just a respected person. Not everybody agrees with everything he says, but that's true with everybody. But he's a very respected person. He's really a very beloved person in many ways. I mean, he's beyond. I think, frankly, if the Democrats had treated him very badly, and then they ended up treating Biden the same way as they treated him, but they treated him very badly. I think if he ran in the Democrat primary, he would have beaten Biden. That's my opinion. But they wouldn't let him run. I mean, they came up with obstacles that were impossible, like you have to have 60% of the vote to run, and they came up with things that were crazy. but they didn't want him running. I think if he would have run in the Democrat primary, I think he would have won. I think he would have beaten Biden.
Mr. Donald Trump, what is...
Wow, that was something, huh? That was something. Fantastic guy. You know, he did well, and the polls are good and all, but you have to remember we have sort of like a two-party system. It was designed that way, and it's awfully tough. And as well as he did, he'd be at 10 and 15 and 16 points sometimes. That's a lot. That's a lot. But if he were in a regular system, like as a Democrat or perhaps as a Republican, but not against me, of course. But if he were in a regular system, there are a lot of people that maybe liked him the best, but they said, we can't vote. So with all of those votes he was getting, he has a lot of votes that he could have gotten. I think he's going to have a huge influence. We're leading now, but I think he's going to have a huge influence on this campaign. Actually, much bigger than you'd see in the polls, and those numbers are big to start off with, but Bobby and I will fight together to defeat the corrupt political establishment and return control of this country to the people. And all who supported Bobby's campaign, I very simply ask you join us in building this coalition. It's a beautiful coalition in defense of liberty and safety, prosperity and peace. It's going to be an incredible coalition, and the relationship has been so good for so long. I have no doubt it's going to work and work well. But we have to win. We have to take our country away from these people that are going to destroy our country. We won't have a country left. So thank you very much. We need your vote.
3 days ago, I was honored to receive the endorsement of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. We're very proud. Thank you. We're very proud to welcome Bobby to our cause. He's really a terrific guy. He's a terrific person, and he's going to do a lot of great things. I have no doubt about it. He's got some very good ideas, some ideas that people weren't listening to. It's turned out to be right. And today I'm honored to officially welcome another true American patriot, a 17-year veteran of the Hawaii Army National Guard, a 4-term Democrat congresswoman, very, very popular, the former vice chair of the National Democratic Party and a 2020 Democrat candidate for the United States presidency. You know, she was a very good candidate. Every time she ran, she was good. She did well. She decided to leave. She couldn't take it anymore, but she is very special. And I didn't know this, but she was a lieutenant colonel. That's not bad. Lieutenant colonel. Not bad. I didn't know that. You know, I just found out. I said, put it down. You got to put that down. That's bigger. That's better than all the other stuff I read. But no, she's a special person. She's got great common sense, great spirit. She loves our country, and she loves the people in this room.
Today, I'm here to tell you that I will not allow your efforts to go to waste. I'm here to tell you that I will leverage your tremendous accomplishments to serve the ideals that we share, the ideals of peace, of prosperity, of freedom, of health, all the ideals that motivated my campaign. I'm here today to describe the path forward that you've opened with your commitment and with your hard labors. Now, in an honest system, I believe that I would have won the election. In a system the kind that my father and my uncles thrived in, a system with open debates, with fair primaries, with regularly scheduled debates, with fair primaries, and with a truly independent media untainted by government propaganda and censorship. In a system of nonpartisan courts and election boards, everything would be different. After all, the polls consistently showed me beating each of the other candidates, both in favorability and also in head-to-head matchups. But I'm sorry to say that while democracy may still be alive at the grassroots, it has become little more than a slogan for our political institutions, for our media, and for our government, and most sadly at all for me, for the Democratic Party. In the name of saving democracy, the Democratic Party set itself to dismantling it, lacking confidence in its candidate, that its candidate could win in a fair election at the voting booth. The DNC waged continual legal warfare against both President Trump and myself. Each time that our volunteers turned in those towering boxes of signatures needed to get on the ballot, the DNC dragged us into court, state after state, attempting to erase their work and to subvert the will of the voters who had signed those petitions. It deployed DNC-aligned judges to throw me and other candidates off the ballot and to throw President Trump in jail. It ran a sham primary that was rigged to prevent any serious challenge to President Biden. Then, when a predictably bungled debate performance precipitated the palace coup against President Biden, the same shadowy DNC operatives appointed his successor, also without an election. They installed a candidate who was so unpopular with voters that she dropped out in 2020 without winning a single delegate. My uncle and my father both relished debate. They prided themselves on their capacity to go toe-to-toe with any opponent in the battle over ideas. They would be astonished to learn of a Democratic Party presidential nominee who, like Vice President Harris, has not appeared in a single interview or an unscripted encounter with voters for 35 days. This is profoundly undemocratic. How are people to choose when they don't know whom they are choosing? And how can this look to the rest of the world? My father and my uncle were always conscious of America's image abroad because of our nation's role as the template for democracy, the role model for democratic processes, and the leader of the free world. Instead of showing us her substance and character, the DNC and its media organs engineered a surge of popularity for Vice President Harris based upon, well, nothing. No policies, no interviews, no debates, only smoke and mirrors and balloons in a highly produced Chicago circus. There in Chicago, a string of Democratic speakers mentioned Donald Trump 147 times just on the first day. Oh, who needs a policy when you have Trump to hate? In contrast, at the RNC convention, President Biden was mentioned only twice in 4 days. I do interviews every day. Many of you have interviewed me. Anybody who asks gets to interview me. Some days I do as many as 10. President Trump, who actually was nominated and won an election, also does interviews daily. How did the Democratic Party choose a candidate that has never done an interview or debate during the entire election cycle? We know the answers. They did it by weaponizing the government agencies. They did it by abandoning democracy. They did it by suing the opposition and by disenfranchising American voters.
This morning, thank you for doing this, by the way. This morning, the Trump campaign announced Robert Kennedy Jr. to the transition team as we talk about a role he might have in a potential Trump second term. What kind of role do you think he might have in the Trump administration?
Well, look, I think, first of all, what Robert Kennedy's endorsement really means is the Kennedy Democrat Party, which my grandparents belonged to, is no longer with us, right? Kamala Harris killed it. It's now the party of open borders, high inflation, and I think it's not surprising that a guy like RFK doesn't feel welcome in that party. Now, he doesn't disagree with us on everything, and of course, we don't agree with him on everything, but it really is an amazing realignment that we're witnessing in American politics, that Robert F. Kennedy is endorsing Donald J. Trump for president. Look, I think the role that I'd love to see RFK play is this is what the transition team fundamentally does, is advising the president on making critical selections for who's going to go in the government, who's going to have an important advisory role. I think RFK talks about a lot of stuff that frankly the media doesn't talk about, like why do we have one of the highest obesity rates in the world? Why do we have such bad health problems with our kids? Skyrocketing rates of mental abuse, skyrocketing rates of addiction. I think there's a lot of like basic health questions that Robert F. Kennedy is going to have an interesting perspective on. And of course he's got interesting perspectives on a lot of things, but that's sort of, when I think about Robert F. Kennedy, I think he's asking important questions about why Americans seem in such poor health, especially poor mental health, and especially our young girls.
Is there any kind of specific role you could see him having in an administration?
I think we'll get to that point once we'll cross that bridge once we come to it, because right now we're thinking about how to win this election, and of course you start the closer you get thinking about the actual kind of government that you want to have in place, and then you figure out who you want to staff in that government. I think it's a little premature to talk about specific roles, but look, I hope RFK has a role because I think he's a smart guy. I think he's fundamentally a good guy, and I'm glad to have him on the team.
I know you said it's too early to talk about specific roles, but have you and the transition team talked about or throwing out names for potential cabinet positions? I mean, have you guys already started formulating those lists?
At a very early level, and some people are talking about it and some people aren't. So yeah, I mean, look, there are already people jockeying for positions, as you can probably anticipate, but I'm not going to say who they are right now.
Thanks for taking my questions earlier. I wanted to ask about RFK Jr. because he said that he had talked with Trump about getting off the ballot in states where he felt he would be a spoiler candidate that would help VP Harris. Yeah. As we know, he is still on the ballot in Michigan and Wisconsin and North Carolina. Michigan and Wisconsin are two very important states, the blue wall states that Harris needs to win.
Sure.
Are you worried about him being on the ballot in Michigan and Wisconsin?
Well, I'm not worried about it, but look at the scandal, right? You have Democratic Secretary of State, very often Democratic bureaucrats, who are not taking RFK off the ballot, even though he's requesting to be taken off the ballot. And meanwhile, Cornel West can't get on the ballot in Michigan, despite the fact that I think he qualified. So they changed this?
Yeah, he got that on.
Okay, so that must be a recent change, because until yesterday, at least I had heard that Cornel West wasn't able to get on the ballot in Michigan. So it just looks like they're trying to put their thumb on the scale, make it easier for Kamala Harris and make it harder for Donald Trump. But we're going to win anyway. But look, I think it's certainly justified to call out some of the ridiculous things that's happening with the media and happening with these Democratic Secretary of State.
And she's worse than him. He is a smarter person than she is. Oh, they're waiting for the debate. If I destroy her in the debate, they'll say, Trump suffered a humiliating defeat tonight, no matter what. Although they did, with Biden, one of the CNN people said that about they said, the Donald Trump performance tonight was the single greatest debate performance I've ever seen. 2 days later, all they did is talk about how bad he was. They didn't talk about me anymore. But no, it's a crooked system, but we're going to make it a very legitimate system again. We can do that, and I think we can do it pretty easily with people like you have over here. I think we can actually do it pretty easily. We will establish a panel of top experts to investigate what is causing the decades-long increase in chronic health problems and childhood diseases, including the autoimmune disorders, autism, obesity, infertility, and much more. And Bobby's going to be very much involved in that. We're going to get him involved because that's what he likes. That's what he's great at. Isn't it great to have a Kennedy with us? Isn't that nice? And this is really, I don't want to disrespect the rest of the family, but this has been the dominant Kennedy for the last 25 years. He's a great guy. I've known him a long time. He's a great guy, and he really wants what's good for the country, and to have his endorsement is a very important thing. And Tulsi endorsed us, too, almost simultaneously. And we love Tulsi. She's been fantastic. She's a woman of great common sense, actually. I've watched her for a long time. She has great common sense.
And one of the things that we learned at home is that we not only had to be virtuous as a nation, we had to be virtuous as individuals. We had to, for example, tell the truth when we did something wrong. So one time I hit a baseball through my mom's window and broke it. And my dad said to me, before you answer this question, I want you to remember what George Washington did. He cut down the cherry tree This is a story every American knew at that time. His father asked him who cut it down, and he said, I did. He always admitted when he was wrong. But now, the Democratic Party has given us a loophole around that mandate. All you have to know is 7 words, and you never have to admit to doing anything wrong again. And do you know what those 7 words are? I was born in the middle class. Oh. So repeat after me, I was born in the middle class. So the next time your boss asks you why you were late for work, what are you going to say? And the next time your wife asks you why you didn't take out the garbage, what are you going to say? And the next time your landlord asks you for the rent check, what are you going to say? That's all you have to know, and you don't have to answer any question. And we know why she didn't want to answer that question, because there's no good answer to it. By every indicia in which we measure the welfare of our economy, the Trump administration excelled, and the Biden-Harris administration has failed us. Inflation on average during the Trump administration was held under 7%. Now it's at 20%. Gross rents have almost doubled. Mortgages have more than doubled in just 3.5 years. Groceries have gone up. Gasoline has gone up. Electricity has gone up. Healthcare has gone up. Do you know the only thing that's gone down? Wages. So though that is not a success story, and I don't blame her for not wanting to answer that question. It was a question that was almost impossible for her to answer truthfully and still walk out of that debate. So the Democratic Party that I grew up with, the Democratic Party of John F. Kennedy, of Robert Kennedy, does not exist today. This was the party of peace. Today, it's the party of war. And we saw President Zelensky come over here. I was so proud of President Trump today, who did a press conference with Zelensky. And the Democrats had done their own press conference, and you know what he got them to do? He got them to sign artillery shells. These are artillery shells that are going to be dropped on women and children. And he got them to sign something else, an $8 billion additional check. Don't you think we could use that money over here in this country? This was a war that we were lied to from day one. We were told that it was an unprovoked invasion. We weren't told that Vladimir Putin and every other Russian leader told us for 30 years, if you go into Ukraine, we're going to have a military reaction. It is a red line for us. Ukraine has a 2,200-mile border with Russia. They've been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. If we put Aegis missile systems in Ukraine, like we've done in Romania and Poland, which they also told us don't go in there, those missiles, Tomahawk missiles, which can be nuclear tipped, will be 3 miles from Moscow. We could decapitate the entire Russian leadership in 3 minutes. My uncle, when the Russians tried to put missiles in Cuba, was going to go to war. And if Putin tried to put missiles in Canada or Cuba or Mexico, we would go to war. So we had to expect that they would do exactly what they told us we were going to do. And if you go into Ukraine with NATO, we're going to go to war. And 2 days before the invasion, Kamala Harris went to Germany and said definitively for the first time by any U.S. leader, we are moving NATO into Ukraine. And that is something that we all need to understand, that provocation. And I was so proud of President Trump because everybody says that he alienates people all over the world. He doesn't know how to be a diplomat. But he was the epitome of diplomacy, and I urge you to go look at the YouTube. He was kind and civil to President Zelensky, but he was also firm in his resolve. And he said, I've had a nice meeting, but I have not changed my mind. We need a peace, and we need to do it very quickly. And we need to protect U.S. interests, not an interest of a country in which we have no strategic interest and no treaty. And he was polite, he was kind, but he was firm in protecting our country. And that's what Donald Trump will always do. And it was especially impressive to me because I know what Donald Trump was thinking while he was having that meeting. He was thinking, I want to turn this guy over and hold him by his legs and shake all the money out of his pockets. And I hope it adds up to $208 billion because that's what we get. That's what the Democrats gave him. And we need to bring that money home and spend it here on our communities. Don't you think you deserve a president who is going to make peace with the world? Who is going to project economic power abroad? They say he's an isolationist. He isn't. He wants to make deals. He's a deal maker. He wants to make deals with China, but not the old kind of deals that benefited only China. He wants to make deals that are going to benefit everybody. He wants to make deals with Russia, the kind that will bring the world into a peaceful economic growth and a boom for all nations. This is what he says again and again. He's not a tyrant. He's not a monster. He just wants the best for the United States of America. And don't you... The Democratic Party that I grew up with was the party of constitutional rights, of civil rights, and particularly the right of freedom of speech, which my uncle and my father treasured. They thought this is the basis. A fundamental bedrock of American democracy is the free flow of information. And when government gets involved in censoring information, that is the beginning of totalitarianism. And we know this because we read Orwell and Aldous Huxley and Robert Heinlein and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Arthur Koestler when we were growing up. And that was the lesson that was repeated in civics lessons again and again. The one thing that you never allow a government to do is to censor speech of any kind. And if you do that, is the first step down the slippery slope of totalitarianism. So the Democrats are trying to say that Donald Trump hates democracy, that he wants to be a dictator, but they're all advocating now, openly advocating the censorship of our speech. And what they say is, well, we don't want to censor all speech, just the lies. If they want to determine what's the truth and what's a lie. And who was the biggest perpetrator of lies during the COVID epidemic? It was the government itself. They were the ones promoting disinformation and misinformation. And I saw this week Hillary Clinton, Tim Walz, and Kamala Harris all using the same talking point. That the next administration is going to get rid of misinformation and disinformation because that is not protected by the First Amendment. Well, it is. The First Amendment protects lies the same as it protects speech, truth. The First Amendment was not written to protect the kind of speech that we all want to hear. It was written for hard times, to protect the speech that nobody wants to hear. And that is the fundamental foundation stone of democracy, that everybody gets to say, to have their own truth. And as Louis Brandeis said, the remedy for bad speech is not censorship, never, because that turns to totalitarianism. The remedy for bad speech is more speech. And that's something that Donald J. Trump understands because he's been censored himself. And he understands it very acutely. He's seen the weaponization of the federal agencies to silence him, to destroy the electoral process, as they did to me. The Democratic Party has not had an election. They're saying that he's destroying democracy, but they felt the need to destroy democracy in order to save it. They would not let me participate in the primary. And Kamala Harris never got a single primary vote. We don't know who appointed her. And that's not democracy. President, don't you want a president who believes in democracy? Don't you want a president who wants to see the censorship ended in this country? Don't you want a president who's going to end the surveillance state and make our country the beacon of freedom around the world once again? And the party that I grew up in. And don't you want a president who is going to protect our border? And raise your hand if you think it's a good idea that the Mexican drug cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, is now running U.S. border policy. That's not good for our country. Do you think that's good for our country? No. It's terrible, and it's terrible for working people. In the last 10 years of his life, I worked very, very closely with Cesar Chavez, who was a very close political ally and personal friend of my father. And during that, and I was a pallbearer at his funeral in 1993. But during that period, I was working with him on pesticide issues because Hispanic farm workers, 15,000 of them are poisoned, many of them killed by pesticide exposures every year, and their families are devastated. Cesar Chavez's other big issue was closing the U.S. border because he understood, and I was at the border many times. The first time I went down between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and I saw there's 27 gaps in the wall that were left by the Biden administration when they shut down construction the day they came into office. And all the material that we've already paid for is sitting right next to those gaps in the wall. They could easily rebuild them right now. President Harris says there's nothing I could do. Yeah, there is. You could just finish the wall. And when I was down there at 2 o'clock in the morning, it looked like the start of the Boston Marathon. There were people, humanity pouring across, and the Border Patrol their job had been repurposed from protecting our borders to escorting people to the Yuma airport and sending them to any destination in our country. It's the most insane thing I've ever seen. And it's crushing the social safety net in our country. And the reason Cesar Chavez wanted to close the border is he saw that all these illegal migrants who were coming across were destroying his capacity to negotiate for good working conditions and good wages for his American workers. And that was obvious at that time, not only to Cesar Chavez, but the entire Democratic Party. Today, because President Trump said we need to close the wall, that's the only thing that they hear. If Trump says it, it must be wrong, so now we're up for an open border. Don't you want a president who is going to reassert control of the U.S. government, of our immigration policy?
Hi, this is Jordan Pear with MLive and the Ann Arbor News. You've talked a lot about like EVs and that kind of stuff today. What would you say to voters who maybe agree with a lot of your policies but are concerned about climate change and environmental impact of the automotive industry?
So here's what I'd say, Sarah, and I appreciate the question. So first of all, the most important thing that we can do to ensure clean air and clean water is to build more and make more stuff in the United States of America. That is the biggest thing. Look, I would be lying to you if I told you that carbon emissions was my number one issue, okay? It's not. But if your number one issue is carbon emissions, look at the two countries that have emitted the most carbon in the last 20, 30 years. It's China and it's India. Make more stuff in the United States of America. That's how you make sure we have clean air and clean water. And Kamala Harris' policies have done the opposite. The other thing I'd say to folks who are worried about the environment is look, I'm worried about the environment too, but here's what I really worry about. I worry about our food supply. Like, what has gone wrong with our food supply that we have got an obesity epidemic in this country unlike we've ever seen in the history of the world? That really worries me. What are we putting, we have all of these weird childhood diseases that we did not have 3, 5, 3 decades ago, 5 decades ago. Does that suggest that we're putting too much weird stuff in our water or too much weird stuff in our food supply? You know what? One of the people that I'm really proud has endorsed this campaign is Bobby Kennedy Jr. And I say that as somebody who was raised by blue-collar Democrats, right? The people who would have been Democrats in the 60s and 70s in this town, those folks have been abandoned by Kamala Harris's Democratic Party. But Bobby Kennedy has this slogan that is so true and has there's a lot of real depth built into it. Make America healthy again. You look at our young people, we have skyrocketing rates of mental health problems in the United States of America. We use 5 times as much antidepressants as some of our peer countries in the world. Why are Americans 5 times as depressed as some of these other countries? I think it suggests that we've got to do a better job at real environmental protection, not the fake Kamala Harris environmental protection, which apparently the only thing it means is ship all of our jobs to China. Let's make Americans healthy again. Let's make our water cleaner and our air cleaner, and that's something Donald Trump and I believe in.
I want to also congratulate somebody who's going to make us all healthy. RFK Jr., we love you. I don't see him. He's campaigning all over the place. He's campaigning. You're all over. Hello, you both. Nice to see you both. You're doing a good job. He's a great guy, too. He really is. He's going to make us a healthier place. We're going to let him go wild for a little while. Then I'm going to have to maybe rein him back. Because he's got some pretty wild ideas, but most of them are really good, I think. He's a good man. And he believes the environment, the healthy people. He wants healthy people. He wants healthy food. And he's going to do it. He's going to have a big chance to do it because we do need that. I would not.
That's my pitch. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Senator Simon Levy in New York Times. Democrats have begun attacking Jill Stein, the third-party Green Party candidate, because she sought help from Republicans in her campaign efforts. I'm just curious what you make of her candidacy. Do you think she's playing spoiler? Do you hope she siphons support from Harris?
Well, look, the Jill Stein thing is interesting because the Democrats will attack Jill Stein while at the same time attacking, or they're trying to keep Bobby Kennedy on the ballot, even though Bobby Kennedy's already endorsed Donald J. Trump. So I think the Democrats, if they're worried about spoilers, they ought to look in the mirror because Bobby Kennedy had a hell of a lot more support than Jill Stein ever did, and they're trying to prevent him from getting off the ballot. Look, I honestly, I don't know much about Jill Stein. I obviously don't think she's going to get a whole lot of votes. But my attitude is the best person to vote for is Donald J. Trump. And the second best person to vote for is anybody not named Kamala Harris. So I don't really care what people do after that. All right. So let me leave you with just a couple of final thoughts. Number one, I want you to go home and, again, whether it's text message, social media, whatever you use or use all of it, get out there and talk about why you're voting for Donald Trump and why you want your neighbors to do the same. That's request number one, okay? Request number two, especially with some of our elderly folks, people who are finding it harder to get the polls, don't just encourage them to go out there and vote. Make a plan to help them vote. You know, I've got family members who, trust me, none of us want on the road, my friends. And we've got other family members who are helping to make sure they've got a plan to drive them to the polls on or before Election Day. I hope you all do that because we got to win this race and we got to count on everybody's vote in order to do that. But the third thing I want to do is I'm going to embarrass, speaking of family members, I've got my big cousin and her family. She's more like my big sister. We've got Rachel Vance in the room. Rachel, where are you? Well, okay, she was sitting right here. Apparently they pulled her backstage because we're getting ready to wrap up. But Rachel, I love you. Thank you for being here, and thanks for spending some time in the beautiful state of Wisconsin. Now, Rachel's from Texas, so she doesn't necessarily believe that Wisconsin weather is always this nice in late October. But I'm telling you, every time I come to town, the weather is perfect. So just make me vice president. I'll come back all the time, and we can always have beautiful weather in the state of Wisconsin. My final thought, my friends, is this. We have a country to save. And when we say that, it's not just about beating the Democrats, as much as it's going to be fun to beat Kamala Harris in just a couple of weeks. It's about giving the American people the kind of government that is going to deliver better prosperity, that's going to make groceries more affordable, that's going to secure that southern border. We've got 16 days to give the American people a government that is fit to lead this great nation. Let's go get it done. God bless you. Thank you, Wisconsin. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, I was driving down here today from Atlanta, and I read an article from the New York Times that Bill Gates had just donated $50 million to Kamala Harris's campaign. And the article said that it was the first donation that he's made in 20 years, that he stayed out of politics, that he's been bipartisan. It was a dark money donation. He didn't intend for it to be public. He routed the donation through a 501c4, which was an organization that was set up to conceal large money donations to the Harris campaign. Now, he said, when the Times asked him, he said he had donated zero in the 2020 campaign when President Biden was running against President Trump. And he said this campaign is different than any other. And so he felt the need to do this. Now, do you think Bill Gates made that donation out of a patriotic impulse? Do you think he made it out of a humanitarian impulse? Do you think he made it because he wants global health? Or because he wants to make America healthy again? Well, there was something else, another article about Bill Gates that came out today that said he's just been indicted. He's been indicted in the Netherlands for lying to the public about the COVID vaccine. And he's going to have to go to trial. You think that he wants to go to trial here in the United States of America? You think maybe that's one of the reasons he chose to give $50 million to Kamala Harris? Oh, I want to point out somebody who's in the audience tonight. She's a woman named Sherry Peebles. And Sherry, are you here? Will you stand up if I can point you out? Okay, so Sherry Peebles is an African-American woman who has a daughter, Shayna, a straight-A student. She missed 60 days of school because she was in a hospital because she had sickle cell anemia. And her mom, Sherry, filled out all the forms, the federal and the state forms, explaining why she was missing her school. She did her schoolwork every day. She got straight A's, as I said. But Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of California. And Kamala Harris learned that the state was losing $1.3 billion a year because of truancy. And she said, I want that money. So I'm going to start putting parents in jail whose children skip too much school. Oh, she arrested Sherry Peebles in her home. The police came in and handcuffed her. And when she said, why am I being handcuffed? The police said to her, talk to Kamala Harris. They didn't want to be doing it either. She lost her job. She lost her home. And she still raised an extraordinary child. Don't you want a president of the United States who's going to end chronic disease rather than putting parents in jail? Don't you want an America president who's going to make our country healthy again? I saw another posting while I was driving down here today that shocked me too, actually. One was of President Obama saying that he didn't understand. That he didn't understand where all the division was coming from and the polarization in this country. And then there was another posting by Kamala Harris standing outside the Naval Observatory, which is the official residence of the Vice President of the United States, standing behind the presidential seal for our country, and comparing Donald Trump to Hitler. And saying that he was a fascist. And she based this extraordinary, irresponsible accusation on a story by John F. King, who was the director of Department of Homeland Security under Donald Trump, and is a former Marine general, and is deep into the deep state and to the intelligence apparatus in this country. Or John F. Kelly, I'm sorry. And Kelly told another story that Donald Trump had, during his presidency, Donald Trump learned that there was a Mexican-American soldier who had been murdered at Fort Hood, and that the Pentagon was refusing to pay her medical expenses, her funeral expenses. And Donald Trump said, if they won't do it, then I'm going to do it myself. And he paid her expenses out of his own pocket. And in order to discredit this extraordinary gesture of love and generosity by the American president, a soldier who he had never met before, John Kelly invented a story that he had made an insensitive remark about Mexicans. Unfortunately for Kelly, there were 3 people in the room at that time who all said that Kelly was lying, that it was an outright fabrication. So we need to wonder when Kelly invents this story that says that, where he said that President Trump wanted generals around him who were like Hitler's generals, which of course he didn't say. We already know that Kelly is a liar. And that Kelly invented other stories that were derogatory about the president. And these are the kind of stories you're seeing from all the generals and the intelligence agents who do not want to see Donald Trump in office again. And we have now somebody who's running for the presidency of the United States, a vice president, who is repeating these irresponsible stories. And to me, that alone disqualifies her for the presidency. You all know that when we were all, most Americans, when we're growing up, of my age at least, we were asked about this moral quandary about whether we would, if we could go back in time and kill a young Hitler, should we do that? And half the people say yeah, half maybe say no. But it's something that we all think about. And you think about how many unstable people there are in this country. And when you compare an American president to Hitler, you're pressing a button in those people to make them act on those violent aspirations and impulses. And it's at worst, don't you want a president who's going to bring America together again? Who's going to end the polarization and the division in our country? I left the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party left me. The Democratic Party that I grew up with was the party of peace. It was the party of constitutional rights, including free speech. It was the party of women's rights and women's sports. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, wrote Title IX to make sure that women could play sports with other women. It was the party of cops and firefighters and working people. And it was the party that stood up to Wall Street, the big banks, big ag, big pharma, big food, and all of the other vested interests that have gained ownership of our government and have captured our agencies and made them predatory against the American public. And the Democratic Party today is the party of war. It is the party of surveillance, of censorship. You listen to President Harris boast about the people who are supporting her, who have flocked now to the Democratic Party, people like John Kelly, people like Dick Cheney. Do you want Dick Cheney back in the White House? And people like John Bolton. These are the people who wrote the Patriot Act, the act that launched the surveillance state, that launched the national security state, that introduced torture, and introduced surveillance, and allowed the CIA to spy on the American public for the first time in our history. They're the people who gave us the Iraq War, who lied to us in order to get us into the Iraq War. That war was the worst foreign policy blunder in American history. That war cost $4.3 trillion. And we killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We created ISIS. We drove 4 million refugees into Europe and destabilized every democracy in Europe for generations. Brexit is a direct result of that war. All of the riots we're seeing now in European cities are a result of that war. The rise of totalitarianism across Europe, the end of free speech across Europe, is a result of that war. And don't you think we should have learned a lesson from that war? You think the Democratic Party learned that lesson? You think Dick Cheney has changed his opinion about the Patriot Act? No. He's changed parties because he thinks the Democratic Party is now the party of the neocons. It's the party of surveillance, of censorship, of war. And it's the party that is a cheerleader for big ag, or big pharma, or the people who are poisoning our children. The most existential threat that our country faces today is this chronic disease epidemic. When my uncle was president, I was a 10-year-old boy. 6% of Americans had chronic disease. 3% were obese. We spent $0 every year treating chronic disease. Zero. Today, 60% of Americans have chronic disease. About 70% are obese or overweight. Do you know how many people are obese and overweight in Japan? 3%. Same as here in 1963. We have 70%. 77% of American kids cannot qualify for military service. The diabetes rates in our country have gone from virtually zero. When I was a kid, the average pediatrician saw one case of diabetes in his entire 50-year career. Today, 1 out of every 3 children who walk through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. When I was a kid, and today, in 70-year-old men, 1 in 10,000 people had autism. Today, 1 in every 34 of our children have autism. 1 in every 22 boys. This is existential for our country. We're spending $4.3 trillion on chronic disease. That's 5 times our military budget. This is going to destroy our country unless we have a president who's going to end it forever. And that's why I am fighting every waking moment of the next 15 days to make sure that Donald Trump is elected President of the United States. Now, when I was a kid, the Republicans controlled all the money in this country. 70% of the wealth in our country was owned by Republicans, about 30% by Democrats. Today, 70% of the wealth is owned by Democrats and 30% by Republicans. There's been a total inversion of policy and of the constituencies of both these parties. The Republican Party has been become the party of working people in this country. About a month ago, I was with Charlie Kirk. Let's give a big hand for Charlie Kirk. And he said to me, he said, Donald Trump ran all the billionaires out of the Republican Party, like Bill Gates. And yesterday, it was announced that Kamala Harris has raised $2 for every $1 that has been raised by Donald Trump. That's because it's all coming from people like Bill Gates. And they have all the money now. We have all the people. Do you think that Kamala Harris could put together a crowd like this? No way. We are going to win this by a landslide. USA. Don't you want a president of the United States that is going to defend our Constitution? I say one other thing. President Harris said today in her post, in her speech, she said that President Trump was going to turn the U.S. military against the American public and use the public to promote his agenda. How many of you think that is true? Well, what's interesting to me is that the Biden-Harris administration has done something 2 weeks ago that has never been done in American history, which is to send exactly lethal force, to send a directive to the Pentagon, changing the law to make it legal for the U.S. military to use lethal force against American citizens on American soil. Technically, now it's legal for the U.S. military under this directive. It will become legal for the U.S. military to shoot and kill Americans who engage in political protests because they disagree with policies in the White House. I'm not making this up. Any of you can look it up. This is a Democratic initiative. This did not come during the Trump administration. This did not come from Donald Trump. It came from the Democratic Party. And that's why I left the Democratic Party. Don't you want a president of the United States who is going to protect our Constitution? Don't you want a president who's going to end all the foreign forever wars? Don't you want a president who's going to stand up for free speech? Don't you want a president who's going to stand up for the Bill of Rights? And don't you want a president who is going to stand up for the Constitution of the United States in every way? And don't you want a president who has the guts to stand up to the CIA? And don't you want a president who is able to stand up to the military-industrial complex and to BlackRock and to Bill Gates and to State Street and Vanguard and Wall Street and Big Ag and Big Pharma and Big Food? And don't you want a president who's going to make America healthy again? And vote for Donald Trump. God bless you all, and God bless America.
Look at that. You know, we do, I don't know if you know, we spend more money by far than any other nation. But we have more chronic health problems also than any nation, more childhood diseases than we did just a generation ago. Millions of Americans are realizing that something is wrong. By getting this fixed, not only will we have healthier families, we will save trillions and trillions of dollars and bring down the cost of health care. With us tonight is the man who's going to help us get it all straightened out, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
We have 1,000 chemicals in our food that are illegal in Europe. But the problem is not from those chemicals. The big problem is corruption in our federal agencies. And these agencies are now owned by Big Pharma, by Big Food, and Big Agriculture. Don't you want a president who's going to get the chemicals out of our food? And don't you want a president who's going to get the corruption out of Washington, D.C.? And don't we deserve a president of the United States that's going to make America healthy again?
Thank you, Bobby. Nobody gets a standing ovation like that. What's going on over here? That's great, Bobby. Great. Thank you. Thank you. And as you know, Bobby's great mother, she was a great woman, Ethel, passed away, so our regards and condolences to the family. Thank you, Bobby. Our movement is bringing together Americans of all backgrounds who believe in freedom, democracy, and a thing called common sense. Much of it's common sense. Conservative, liberal, it's common sense. Let me also call up two other incredible patriots who want to help save our incredible country. Former Democrat presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard, and By the way, she just became a Republican. And a great man, a brilliant person, and a true character, Tucker Carlson.
Something? I think Donald Trump's singular contribution to this country and the world is by his presence exposing a lot of things a lot of us believed as fraudulent, as lies. It's changed my life watching it. But the single biggest lie that Donald Trump has exposed is that this is a functional democracy, when in fact, it's a country oppressed by a small group of its unhappiest citizens for their own benefit. And the promise of this campaign is that Donald Trump will return this country to its owners. And that's its population, that's its people, that's its citizens. And I pray fervently that that happens. I mean it. That's why I'm so honored to be here. Thank you.
We have seen from the very beginning how much President Trump has been attacked, smeared, censored, the government weaponized against a candidate for president and a former president in ways that have never been seen in our country before. The reason why this has happened is because he is the sole person who has had the courage to stand up against the uniparty war machine in Washington and have the audacity to call for peace and an end to war. While he has challenged the swamp creatures in Washington, all of you have resoundingly nominated him for president 3 times in the last 3 presidential elections. We know whose side he stands on. He stands on the side of the people. He stands on the side of peace and prosperity and freedom for all Americans. It's why I'm proud to stand with President Trump and why we, the people, must vote to send him back to the White House and make America great again.
Great people.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of people ask me why I left the Democratic Party. And I say, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. This is not the party anymore of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy, of John Kennedy. That was the party of peace. It was the party of constitutional rights, of civil rights, of freedom of speech. It was the party that wanted to protect and nurture the middle class. It was the party that stood up to censorship, to surveillance, that stood up to the CIA, to the military complex, military-industrial complex. And it was the party that wanted to protect public health and women's sports. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, wrote Title IX, which protected women's sports in college. It was the party that believed in voting rights and fought for the right of every American to vote for the person of their choice. Today's Democratic Party is the party of war. It's the party of the CIA. You had Kamala Harris giving a speech at the Democratic Convention that was written by neocons, that was belligerent, pugnacious, that talked about the domination of the world by the United States through our weapons of war. It's the party today that wants to divide Americans. It's the party that is dismantling women's sports by letting men play women's sports. It's the party of Wall Street. It's the party of Bill Gates, who just gave $50 million to Kamala Harris. It's the party, and the Harris campaign is very proud that it received the endorsement of 50 former CIA agents and officers, and of John Bolton, and of Dick Cheney. These are the people that gave us the war in Iraq, the worst foreign policy catastrophe that's ever happened to this country. These are the people that gave us the Patriot Act, that launched the surveillance state. These are the people that are trying to undermine voting rights in this country by weaponizing the federal agencies against political candidates, including me and Donald Trump and all other political candidates that can't win an election. And instead of bringing in a candidate who wins the primaries, abolish the primaries, and then pick two candidates, anointed them without receiving votes. We don't even know how Kamala Harris received the nomination. And this is the party of Wall Street, of big banks, of big data, of big tech, of the military contractors, and the parties of big pharma, big ag, big food, and big chemicals. This is the party that's given us the sickest children in the history of the world. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease, and we spent zero on chronic disease in this country. Today, 60% of Americans have chronic disease. This is existential for our country. We're spending $4.3 trillion a year, 5 times our military budget. 77% of American boys cannot qualify for military service because of chronic disease diagnoses. This is existential for our country. President Trump called me 3 hours after his shooting. And he said, would I come and sit down with them? And he said to me during that meeting, he said, there are some things that we can agree on and some we disagree on, but the landscapes on which we agree are so much larger. He said, I want to end the wars. I want to end this surveillance and censorship. I want to protect the Constitution. I want to protect freedom of speech. I want to end the surveillance. I want to end the weaponization of government against American politicians. And I want to end the chronic disease epidemic. Now, don't you think that we deserve a president in this country who's going to restore the moral authority of the United States of America? Don't you think that we deserve a president who's going to end the warfare state and rebuild the middle class. Don't you want a president who's going to put America first? And don't you want a president who's going to protect our children? And who's going to protect women's sports? And who's going to stop dividing this country along racial lines? And don't you want a president who's going to end the corruption at the federal agencies, at FDA, at NIH, at CDC, and at the CIA? And don't you want a president who's going to make America healthy again? And don't you want a president who's going to make America great again? And we need to go to the polls on November 5th and vote for Donald Trump. God bless you and God bless America.
Thank you. And we also have somebody that is great. And look, we're not going to let him go too crazy, Elon, with the oil and gas stuff. And, you know, because Robert F. Kennedy cares more about human beings and health and the environment than anybody. And he's going to be absolutely, having him is such a great honor. I've been friends of his for a long time. And I'm going to let him go wild on health. I'm going to let him go wild on the food. I'm going to let him go wild on medicines. The only thing I don't think I'm going to let him even get near is the liquid gold that we have under our feet. I don't know, Elon, he might not like liquid gold. It's oil and gas, sometimes referred to as oil and gas. JD, I think we're going to have to keep him away from the oil and gas. What do you think, Howard? Yes? But where is Robert? He's around. He gave a beautiful speech. He's a great guy. He truly cares. I mean, he truly cares about this. And
thank you, MAGA. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I smell a landslide on Tuesday. Oh, I've been on the road for 19 months now. And a little over thank you. Thank you, MAGA. I lost a lot of friends and a lot of family, but I have a much bigger family now. We're all held together by blood and by DNA, and that is our basic relationships in our lives. But the most important relationships come from shared values. And everybody in this auditorium shares the value. They love this country and they love freedom. and they love our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. And I saw those things in danger in a very acute way during the COVID pandemic. And that is one of the principal reasons that I made the decision 19 months ago to run for President of the United States. And then a little over a year ago, I left the Democratic Party. That was a difficult decision for me because the Democratic Party was the home for me, that it was incomprehensible to me that I would ever leave it. My great-great-grandparents came over here, all of them, in 1848 during the height of the potato famine. They landed on the docks of Boston, penniless, and they were met there by the Democratic Party, and the party took care of them. It found them homes, it found them jobs, it located them in communities, it was where their churches were, and it gave them a sense of value and community and a love for this country. And my great-grandfather, Honey Fitz, was the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. His contemporary, Patrick Kennedy, was a state senator and a political boss in Boston. My uncle, John Kennedy, was the first Irish Catholic president. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, was the second longest serving member of the United States Senate. My father was a U.S. senator and attorney general and died running for president of the United States. And it was inconceivable to me that I would ever leave the Democratic Party. But I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. The Democratic Party that I grew up with was the party of peace. It was the party of civil rights and constitutional rights, and particularly freedom of speech. It was the party that had skepticism toward the CIA and the national security state. It was the party that was also skeptical of Wall Street and the corporate domination of American democracy. It was the party of women's rights. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, wrote Title IX to make sure that women could play sports in college. And it was the party of democracy. It was the party that fought hard to make sure that every American had the right to vote for the candidate that they chose to vote for. Today's Democratic Party is the party of war. It's the party of Dick Cheney. It's the party of John Bolton. These were the people who lied us into the Iraq War, the greatest foreign policy cataclysm in American history. These are the men who wrote the Patriot Act that introduced the surveillance state and gave the CIA permission to spy on Americans, to propagandize Americans. It's the party that is trying to dismantle Title IX and let men play women's sports. The party I grew up with was the party of cops and firefighters and working people. And now, that's the Republican Party. The Democratic Party today is no longer the party that is skeptical of the CIA. The CIA and the neocons wrote Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic Convention, the most bellicose, pugnacious speech that we've ever seen at a Democratic convention. Before she went on, she was immediately preceded by a former CIA director. This would be unthinkable in the Democratic Party I grew up in. They've become the party of the swamp. They've become the party of Wall Street, of big tech, of big data, of big pharma, of big ag, big chemical, and the military-industrial complex. And their party not of civil rights, but of division that is tearing our country apart. And so I made a decision to run for president 19 months ago. A little over a year ago, I left the Democratic Party for all of those reasons. And then in August of this year, President Trump called me on August 23rd, immediately after his shooting at Butler. He called me 3 hours later on the telephone, and he asked me to meet with him the next day in Milwaukee. And we had a 2.5-hour meeting then and a number of subsequent meetings. And during those meetings, he urged me to unify our parties and to work with him to reclaim the values that Robert Kennedy stood for, that John Kennedy stood for. He said he wanted to end the forever wars and bring that $200 billion that we've sent to the Ukraine home to rebuild America. He told me that he wanted to end the censorship and end the surveillance and the propaganda. And that he wanted to put an end to the weaponization of law enforcement agencies against the American political system. And that he wanted to end this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that has turned our regulatory agencies predatory against the American public. And he said that he wanted to make America healthy again. And end the chronic disease epidemic that is destroying our children. And that is an existential threat to our nation. When my uncle was president and I was a 10-year-old boy, the rate of chronic disease in this country was 6%. Today, it's 60%. When my uncle was president, we spent zero on chronic disease in this country. There were no drugs to treat it. Today, we spend $4.3 trillion. $4.3 trillion, that's 5 times our military budget. It's the largest cost to our nation, and it is bankrupting us. And it is destroying us morally, because we are betraying our children by letting these industries poison them. The rate of obesity at that time was 3%. Today, it's 50% in our children. And 74% of Americans are obese or overweight. Well, we didn't suddenly become lazy and gluttonous. We are being mass poisoned by corrupt industry. In Japan, where they don't have this kind of corruption, the obesity rate is 3%. That's what it's supposed to be, 3%. It's not supposed to be 50%, and this is a national security threat. 77% of American kids are no longer qualified for military service because of chronic disease diagnoses. And what are these diseases? They're obesity, There are neurodevelopmental disorders, and I'm going to list some of them because I'm a 70-year-old man. And when I was a boy, I never heard of any of these diseases because nobody had them. You know, I had 11 siblings. I had about 70 first cousins. And I didn't know anybody with ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, sleep disorders, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, or autism. The autism rate in my generation today in 70-year-old men is 1 in 10,000. The autism rate in our children is 1 in 34. In California, as Callie just said, it's 1 in 24. And the rate in boys is much higher. We also saw this explosion of autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease and lupus and juvenile diabetes, all of these exotic diseases that we never heard of as a kid. The diabetes rate when I was a kid was effectively 0. A typical pediatrician, when I was a young boy, would see 1 case of diabetes in his lifetime, in his career, a 40 or 50-year career. Today, 1 out of every 3 children who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And nobody's talking about it. Nobody's saying anything. Nobody is recognizing that we are being mass poisoned by big pharma and big food. And all these allergic diseases that suddenly appeared. I never knew a kid anywhere in any of the schools that I went to that had a peanut allergy or food allergies or eczema. My brother had asthma, and he was told by his doctor there will never be a cure for asthma because it's so rare that nobody will ever study it. Today, 1 out of every 8 black children in America's cities has asthma. What is happening to our children? And I saw this happening, and I began writing about it, and the media rose up and silenced me in 2005. And nobody would talk about it. The doctors wouldn't talk about it. The pediatricians wouldn't talk about it. The scientists, the government officials. And people warned me, if you keep talking about this, you're going to destroy your career. And I was stunned by this. And for 19 years, since 2005, I spend 30 minutes praying every day when I get out of bed. And my prayer is this. I ask God for 19 years to put me in a position where I could end the chronic disease epidemic and bring health back to our children. And in August, God sent me Donald Trump. Now, we're 5 days out from an election, and it's an election that we are certain to win. If every vote is counted, if all the votes are counted, we're going to win this election. Oh, now, the medical industrial complex. And I want to remind you of this. I've been told to go on a little longer because President Trump is not yet in the building. You know, I was going to tell you this. When I was 7 years old, I went to the inauguration of my uncle as president in Washington, D.C. And 3 days before that, President Eisenhower, the outgoing president, made what today we have to regard as the most important speech in American history. And it was the speech where he told Americans that they should be in fear of the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would erode our democracy, that would subvert our democratic institutions, that would steal our money and steal our resources and bankrupt the middle class in this country and make us weak in the long run. And I urge you to go look at that speech, because after he talks about the military-industrial complex, he says, and by the way, just as bad is the medical-industrial complex, which will pervert science, which will lie to the public, which will turn science to serve industrial and corporate interests, the mercantile ambitions of big corporations. Oh. Oh. As soon as Donald Trump started talking about giving me the power, he asked me to do three things. He asked me to root out the corruption. And end the conflicts of interest in our regulatory agencies. And end this corporate capture that has turned our regulatory agencies into sock puppets of the industries they're supposed to regulate. And he asked me to restore the tradition of gold standard, empirically based, evidence-based science and medicine in our regulatory agencies. And to restore the transparency so that these agencies must stop hiding science from us when it clashes with the commercial ambitions of the pharmaceutical industry. And he doesn't want me to take vaccines away from people. If you want to take a vaccine, you ought to be able to take it. We believe in free choice in this country. Oh, you ought to know the risks and benefits of everything you take. And we need good science for that. And we need informed consent. And he asked me to do that, and then he asked me to end the chronic disease epidemic in this country. And he said, I want to see results, measurable results, in the diminishment of chronic disease within 2 years. And I said, Mr. President, I will do that. Oh, this has caused a lot of aggravation and apoplexy among a certain class of the medical elites. And today, the Washington Post and NBC and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal all did articles talking about what a catastrophe it's going to be if I get anywhere near the medical establishment. And I read the articles because I wanted to see the names of the people who were denouncing me. And every one of them is on the pharma payroll. These are what the media calls experts. But these are the same experts that made us the sickest country in the history of the world. Whatever they're doing is not working. We had during this country, these are the guys who gave us the COVID countermeasures, which shut down our schools, which closed our churches, which shut down 3.3 million businesses in this country. All the little businesses, and they left open the Walmarts and Facebook and all of the big people who were cashing in on the pandemic. And these are the people who are treating disease. For them, for these people, the most valuable asset in America is a sick child. They don't want your child dead. They want him sick for life. Then he's dependent on their products. And the more statins they prescribe for heart disease, the more heart disease goes up. The more metformin they prescribe for diabetes, the more diabetes we have. The more antidepressants they prescribe, the more people we have who are depressed. The more Ambien they prescribe, the more insomnia there is. The more opioids they prescribe, the more pain there is. The more Viagra they prescribe, the higher ED goes. And so these drugs, their formula, this pharmaceutical paradigm, is not working. And President Trump wants to do something different. And somebody called me one of the anchors of ABC today, and I had an off-the-record discussion with him. And he said, there's so much division in this country. And I said, that's because you're causing it. My nephew, who's traveled with me for 19 months, he's my wife Cheryl's nephew, and he's been working for me for 19 months and traveled everywhere with me, and he's met President Trump many times now. And he said to me today, he said, everybody who's met President Trump loves President Trump. He said, you can't help but love him. So why does half of America hate him? They haven't met him, and the media is telling them to hate him. And I said this. I said, you're demonizing him, you're vilifying him, you're calling us garbage, you're calling him Hitler, you're calling him a fascist, and of course people are going to hate him. And I said, and by the way, you're writing all these articles condemning me coming into Washington, dismantling the pharmaceutical paradigm. Where are you getting your salary? From pharma. And he said, we tell both sides of the story. And I said, no, you don't. And he said, well, President Trump is saying radical things. I said, like what? He said he's going to pull CBS's license. And I said he ought to pull CBS's license. CBS doesn't own the airwaves. We do. The people of the United States own the airwaves. CBS is licensed to use the airwaves, but only for a public purpose, to advance the public benefit. We have a doctrine in this country called the Fairness Doctrine that says if you're licensed to own a network, you got to tell the news at least once a day, and you got to be fair to both sides. And I said to this guy, I said, you know, I was running for 19 months when Ross Perot ran in 1992 for 10 months. He did 34 live interviews on the airwaves, on the national networks. And I said, I did 4 in 19 months, and your network never let me on a single time. You're only telling one side of the story. And the only thing you'll report about Donald Trump is propaganda to make people despise him. And, you know, one of the things I'm going to advise Donald Trump to do in order to correct the chronic disease epidemic is to ban pharmaceutical advertising on TV. There's only 2 countries in the world that allow pharmaceutical advertising on the airwaves. One of them is New Zealand and the other is us. And we have the highest disease rate, and we buy more drugs, and they're more expensive than anywhere in the world. Italy spends about 1/6 that we spend on health care, and Italians live 7 years longer. So whatever they're doing does not work. And don't you want a president who is going to fix this country? Don't you want a president who's going to end the addiction to foreign wars? And don't you want a president who's going to end the censorship and surveillance and return freedom of speech to our country? And don't you want a president who's going to clean out the corruption and drain the swamp at the regulatory agencies? And get the chemicals out of our food and protect our children and restore their health and make America the healthiest country in the world, which it was when I was a kid. Don't you want a president who's going to make America healthy again? And don't we deserve a president who will make America great again? Will you go to the polls on Tuesday and make sure that we all ride that big garbage truck to Washington, D.C.? Now I want to bring on my friend and one of my great heroes, Tucker Carlson. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. I started my presidential campaign 19 months ago, and the Democrats fought. They canceled the primary so I couldn't run, and they canceled the debates, and then I switched to independence. And I was taking more votes away from Donald Trump than the Democrats. But Donald Trump never sued me, and he never said anything nasty about me. He was always very civil. And the Democrats sued me, and they sued me to keep me off the ballot. They spent $10 million. They filed suits in 10 states. And then when I endorsed President Trump in August, they sued me to keep me on the ballot. And they lost most of those suits. Yes, 2 days ago, they won 2 of them in Wisconsin and in Michigan. And why did they do that? They did that because they want to confuse the voters. They want to interfere with the election because they're keeping somebody on the ballot who's not running. So when you go to the voting booth on Tuesday, you're going to see my name on the ballot. I do not want your vote. I want you to vote for Donald Trump. Because I do. The only way I'm going to go to Washington is if we get Donald Trump elected. And that's the only way we're going to fix this catastrophe that is impacting our children, this chronic disease epidemic. When I was a 10-year-old boy, my uncle was president of the United States, and 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. When my uncle was president, we spent 0 on chronic disease in this country. There wasn't even medications for any chronic diseases. Today, we spend $4.3 trillion every year. It's 5 times our military budget. It is bankrupting our country. It is hurting our national security. 77% of American children cannot qualify for military service because of a chronic disease diagnosis. When my uncle was president, 3% of Americans were obese. Today, 50% of our children are obese. And this isn't true in other countries. In other countries, it's the same as it was then. In Japan, 3% of the people are obese. It's impacting our country because we're mass poisoning ourselves, and we're poisoning our children. There's 1,000 ingredients in our food that are illegal in Europe. And the problem is not those ingredients. The problem is the corruption in Washington, D.C., the capture of our agencies. And the only president who's going to clean that up is Donald J. Trump. We have the sickest children in the world. When I was a kid, the autism rates, and today in my generation, 70-year-old men, 1 in 10,000 of us has autism. In my children's generation, it's 1 in every 34 children, 1 in every 24 in California. When I was a kid, juvenile diabetes was unknown. The typical pediatrician would see 1 case of diabetes in his entire career, a 40 or 50-year career. Today, 1 out of every 3 children who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. We are killing our kids. 40% of our kids are on antidepressants. The sperm counts have dropped 50%. Testosterone levels have dropped 50%. American girls are reaching puberty at 10 to 13 years old, 6 years younger than they were a generation ago. We are destroying these children. I had 11 brothers and sisters. I had 70 first cousins. I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. Why do 5 of my kids have peanut allergies? Why do all of our kids have eczema and asthma and allergies? This is not normal. I know what a normal child looks like. And our kids today are injured and they're damaged. And they're damaged because we're being poisoned. And that comes from corruption. Oh. I started working on this issue 19 years ago. And for 19 years, I have got every morning, without one exception, I have said a prayer to God to put me in a position where I could end the chronic disease epidemic. And on August 23rd of this year, God sent me Donald J. Trump. And Donald Trump said to me in Milwaukee, we met for 2.5 hours, and he said, I want you to join my campaign and unify our efforts, and I'm going to end the foreign wars, the addiction to war. The $200 billion that we sent to Ukraine, we're going to spend it here in the United States. And he told me, we're going to end the censorship. We're going to end the surveillance. We're going to end the weaponization of our enforcement agencies against the American people. And he knew that my uncle, Ted Kennedy, wrote Title IX to make sure that women's sports are protected in schools. And he said, we're going to end the efforts of the Democratic Party, the war that they're making on women's sports in schools. And he said, we're going to end the chronic disease epidemic, and we are going to make America healthy again. Oh, don't you want a president who's going to get the toxins out of our food? Oh, you want a president who's going to end the corruption in Washington, D.C.? And don't you want a president who's going to end all the foreign wars that are sucking away our money and our... And don't you want a president who's going to end the censorship, end the surveillance, and protect the Constitution of the United States? And don't you want a president who's going to make this a free country again, where we treasure our liberties? A president who's going to make America healthy again? A president who's going to make America great again? And let's go to the polls on Tuesday and deliver a landslide for Donald J. Trump. Thank you all very much.
But it's a lot of things. Another one who's another great mind and a great guy and so popular, and I think he's right. He wants to make people healthy. It's driven him pretty wild over the last number of years, and the Democrats didn't treat him well. He was doing fantastically well, and I think they came out with some rule that you had to do this, Mike. You had to get 70 or 75% of the vote to qualify to be in the primary. That was a pretty tough thing to get. And he was doing incredibly well, and he decided he can't do it, went independent. Now he's with us all the way. And today I nominated him for, I guess, if you like health and if you like people that live a long time, it's the most important position, RFK Jr. Bobby? Good. And I just looked at the news reports. People like you, Bobby. Don't get too popular, Bobby. Oh. You know, you've reached about the level. Now, we want you to come up with things and ideas and what you've been talking about for a long time, and I think you're going to do some unbelievable thing. Nobody's going to be able to do it like you, and boy, does he feel it in his heart. So congratulations also to your family. And a woman who was a Democrat and was an independent, she went independent, and last week she said, I want to be a Republican because this is what I stand for. And I've always admired her. And I've admired her because she was loaded up with common sense. And it's all about common sense. I mean, we're conservative in this room, but we can understand the